Head of the executive branch. Gives hope, leader, influencer, believer. All of these are jobs the President of the United States. Hundreds, or even thousands, have tried to become it, but only a small amount of them have ever had the political talent and prowess to make it into office. Let's start with Herbert Hoover. Many people know the name Hoover because lots of things are named after him. Herbert Hoover was elected President of the United States in 1928. In late 1929, a large stock market crash occurred, causing the Great Depression. Many Americans blamed Hoover, but Hoover blamed it on a lack of trust in the banks. He gathered business owners and told them to try not to lower wages or fire anyone. This, of course, did not work because just asking businesses to try and avoid things is not going to happen. Being a president in a time of crisis like this could not have been easy. Every decision he made had consequences. He had to rebuild America's economy with unemployment over 20%. But Hoover's big picture idea of how to get out of the Depression was very much flawed. He thought the government should mostly stay out of it and try and grow businesses, such as banks and railroads, back to where they were. Looking at it, it makes sense how that would work. The Depression started because there was declining trust in banks, so if you make the banks and other industries similar to it stronger, the economy will climb up again. But when the damage is already done, you need the government to intervene. When you look at what Hoover did in his presidency, he did pass a good amount of bills to attempt to help with the Depression. While he didn't get America out of the Depression, he didn't do nothing. He executed his plan to try and rebuild the banks, but his idea was the thing that was flawed, not the way he executed it. Herbert Hoover's presidency was defined by a stock market crash that was not his fault. He did his best to try and to prevent it, but his big picture idea was flawed. Many experts call him one of the worst presidents ever because of the way he handled the Depression. This was one of the toughest situations a president has ever been in, but it is the job of the president to get out of it. All the great presidents navigated their way around crisis, starting with George Washington in the Revolution, to Lincoln during the Civil War, and Franklin Roosevelt with the end of the Depression and World War II. The best presidents have to make the tough decisions, and the next president we are going to talk about is a president who had to make one of the toughest decisions ever. Harry S. Truman was chosen by Franklin Delano Roosevelt to be his vice president in his fourth term in 1945 when World War II was still going on. But when FDR tragically died in April of that year, Truman had to step in as the president and continue fighting in one of the largest wars ever. But in August of that year, only 4 months into his presidency, Truman decided to use the newly developed weapon of mass destruction, the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb was a project that started in 1939, known as the Manhattan Project. Truman didn't even know the details of the project till late April. But after the Potsdam Conference, when Japan refused to surrender, he chose to have both atomic bombs dropped in Japan, leaving nearly 150,000 dead. After that, Japan surrendered, ending World War II. It must have been hard for him as president. He was only vice president for 2 months and had to be a leader of a very large and powerful country in a time when the whole world was fighting against each other. Choosing to kill hundreds of thousands of civilians was a controversial move, but Truman remained on the stance that it saved more lives than it lost. Truman popularized the saying, "The buck stops here." He even kept a little sign on his desk in the Oval Office. In this context, it means that the president made the decision and that will accept the consequences for making that decision, for example, dropping an atomic bomb. Harry Truman was also a key member in founding the United Nations, which could help prevent further conflicts such as World War II. Having a large conflict is not your only way for your presidency to be remembered. With some of the earlier presidents, expanding the United States was a priority. This president was relentless and persistent in getting the land that he wanted that greatly increased the size of the United States with westward expansion. His name is James K. Polk, one of the most determined and hard-working presidents of all time. Polk worked for Andrew Jackson's campaign the first time he ran for president, and Jackson told the American public how gritty and determined Polk was as a person. Since Jackson was a very popular president and many trusted his judgment, when Polk ran for office, lots of people voted for him. He won the election in 1945. Polk came into the Oval Office with 4 goals in mind: lower taxes, establish an independent U.S. Treasury, finish up the deal with the British to get Oregon Territory, and acquire New Mexico and California from Mexico. The thing is, every leader throughout history has made promises that they may or may not have kept. But what is amazing about Polk is that he accomplished every one of his goals. He knew what he needed to do and how to do it. Also, his plan was not that easy to pull off. He had to find a way to buy a ton of land from the British while also having to fight a war with Mexico, and he said he would lower taxes. He practically finished off the America's Manifest Destiny plan. He was a very large part in growing America. Oh, and he also only did it in 4 years. He didn't see any need in re-election because he had already done so much in evolving the United States. He did everything he wanted to. Sometimes that's what a good president is. Just getting things done, even if you only have 4 years. Now let's take a quick look at a president who didn't get anything done because he didn't have the time. When William Henry Harrison was elected president in 1841, he was the oldest person to ever be elected office at 68 years old. He was also the last president to be born before the start of the Revolutionary War. On his inauguration day, on March 1st, 1841, he gave the longest inaugural address that any president has ever given. During the 100 minutes he was talking, rain started pouring down and it became very cold, but Harrison refused to wear a hat or coat, claiming it would look unpresidential. He became very sick of typhoid fever after he gave the speech, and he died on April 1st. Many believe the lengthy address with no coat is his cause of death, but there may have also been another cause of death. The White House drinking water also shows signs of being contaminated, so him not wearing a coat may not have killed him. We don't know if he would have been a good president or not. While he was not president for long, people still elected him president, and that is an honor. And his political talents run in the family because Harrison's grandson, Benjamin, was elected the 23rd president of the United States in 1889. Benjamin Harrison came from a strong political family. As mentioned before, his grandfather, William Henry Harrison, was president, and also his great-grandfather, Benjamin Harrison V, was a member of Congress during the Revolutionary War and signed the Declaration of Independence. He accomplished a good amount in his presidency. He raised taxes on imported goods and created the Sherman Antitrust Act, which made monopolies illegal. A big story of his presidency was how to try and rebuild the nation's economy. The Great Depression was 40 years away, but people speculated that an economic fallout was in this country's future. Harrison passed laws with Congress that raised taxes on the middle and lower class and lowered taxes on the upper class. Many Americans were very angry at Harrison and the Republicans for not worrying about the lower class and just focusing on themselves. The problem was, Harrison was known as the human iceberg. He would not accept any ideas that challenged him. He was a deeply religious man, and he believed that he became God's friend when he was president. Harrison didn't get too much done in his one term as president. He did acquire the Samoan Islands from Germany, but his inability to have his ideas challenged held him back as president, and he was not very popular. Popularity is a very important thing to becoming president, and also staying president. One of the most popular guys to ever run for president was Dwight D. Eisenhower, or Ike. In fact, he was so popular that in 1948, both major political parties tried to get him to run for them. Eisenhower was a 5-star general during World War II, which is the second highest rank in the U.S. Army. When he ran for president in 1953, America was still very proud of their victory in Europe and Japan, and was very excited that a high-ranking military general would be leading the country.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John or Dean or Harry, let's do that big job right. Let's get in step with the guy that's left, get in step with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We got to get where we are going, travel day and night for president. Let Adelaide go the other way, we'll all go with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington, we'll take Ike to Washington.
Now is the time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country.
Eisenhower was kind of like our 7th president, Andrew Jackson, retired war hero and man of the people. Eisenhower would hold lots of press conferences to let the American public know what was going on. In office, a lot of what Eisenhower handled was war-related. Not because he knew war, but because there were lots of wars just wrapping up or starting. He had to maintain peace by ending the Korean War. He also refused to supply more bombs to the Department of Treasury to help defend against Russia during the Cold War, because he feared the Cold War could escalate into another world war if both countries just kept on building defenses. This was a very critical turning point in America, and both parties wanted control of the branches of government so they can make the tough decisions. And Eisenhower helped the Republicans get in power because he was so popular. The Republicans wanted to stay in power, and they used Eisenhower's popularity to do it. He didn't even want to run for a second term until some senators told him it was a good idea. Ike was smart, and he knew how to get people to like him, which got his party power for 8 of the most critical years in modern American history. This is something that always happens in elections, but it was pulled off masterfully by the Republicans and let them keep power. While some presidents gain the respect and trust of the people by just being themselves, some try to cheat to get it. Richard Nixon started out in Washington as the new young congressman from California. Later, he was elected president in 1968 to 1972. In his 72 re-election, even though he was just president, he and fellow Republicans were upset at the polls in the Solid South, which was a large group of southern states, were mainly voting for Democrats, and those states included Texas and Florida, which are two of the top 4 states with the most electoral votes. And also, to add to the frustration, Edward Kennedy, the person Nixon thought he would have to face in the general election, lost out to South Dakota Senator George McGovern. Then, on June 17, 1972, 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate complex. These men were traced by the FBI back to Richard Nixon's campaign. More and more, Nixon's close workers, such as Alex Butterfield, told the media about Nixon's secret taping system, which would help him steal the Democratic strategy and win more votes. A lot of this information came out after Nixon won the election 49 out of 50 states, the most whopping landslide victories in history. After these stories came out, Nixon lost the majority of his support, even among his own party. Nixon admitted that he did make some mistakes, but he insisted that he did not send the men to break into the Watergate complex, and he didn't do anything illegal. Nixon tried to fight the accusers, but a new tape release revealed that Nixon was aware of the men breaking into the DNC.
That's fine. Now, on the investigation, the Democratic break-in thing, we're back in the problem area because the FBI is not under control because Gray doesn't exactly know how to control it, and their investigation is now leading into some productive areas because they've been able to trace the money, not through the money itself, but through the bank, sources, the banker itself, and it goes some directions we don't want it to go. Also, there have been some things like an informant came in off the street to the FBI in Miami with there's a photographer who has a friend who's a photographer who developed some films for this guy Parker, and the films had pictures of Democratic National Committee letterhead documents and things. So there's things like that that are filtering in. Mitchell came up with yesterday, and John Dean analyzed very carefully last night and concurs now with Mitchell's recommendation that the only way to solve this, and we're set up beautifully to do it, in that the only network that paid any attention to last night was NBC, who did a massive story on the Cuban thing and all. But the way to handle this now is for us to have Walters call Pat Gray and just say, stay the hell out of this. This is business here we don't want you going any further on. That's not an unusual development. And that would take care of it. He doesn't want it. Pat does want to. He doesn't know how to, and he doesn't have any basis for doing it. Given this, he will then have the basis. He'll call Mark Felt in, and the two of them, and Mark Felt wants to cooperate because he's ambitious. He'll call them in and say, we've gotten the signal across the river to put the hold on this. And that'll fit rather well because the FBI agents who are working the case at this point feel that's what it is a CIA. But they're tracing the money to them. Well, they've traced it to a name that they haven't got to the guy yet. Who's money here? Ken Dahlberg. Ken Dahlberg said he gave $25,000 in Minnesota. And the check went directly in to this guy Parker. Or maybe he just he did it. I mean, this is from the committee, though. It's expanded. It's directly.
With Nixon facing almost certain impeachment and the country turned against him, he resigned as president.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Nixon almost faced impeachment, but resigned before it happened. The impeachment process works like this. When there's a scandal that violates the Constitution, the House of Representatives votes to impeach the president. If they do, the president is impeached. Then, the House sends articles of impeachment to the Senate, where they vote whether or not to convict the president. If the Senate votes to convict the president is removed from office and the vice president becomes the president. If they vote not to convict him, then the president goes back to being the president. No president has ever been removed from office through impeachment. There have been 3 impeachments as of 2020. Bill Clinton and Donald Trump were both impeached in more recent years, but a lesser-known impeachment happened in 1868. Andrew Johnson was Abraham Lincoln's vice president for his second term. Even though Johnson was pro-slavery and a former slave owner himself, there were a few reasons he was chosen to be Lincoln's running mate. Lincoln still had a lot of hate from the South, and choosing a Southerner and slave owner would be good for getting more voters on his side. Also, Lincoln and Johnson were both born into poverty and were self-made politicians. When Lincoln was assassinated, a pro-slaver became president, which is not what the Republicans wanted. They hoped to use Johnson to get more power by helping Lincoln get reelected, and now they were giving it away. It was now up to Johnson to rebuild the nation after an awful civil war. The problem was, Johnson was still pro-slavery. Even though he released all his slaves during the war and supported the North, he still actively opposed the 14th Amendment, which recognized all black people as citizens. He was very nice to the South after the war, and often vetoed laws passed by Congress that punished the South for their actions, earning himself the nickname Veto President. Congress grew tired of Johnson continuously shooting down their ideas, so they impeached Johnson for violating the Tenure of Office Act when he fired a man that Congress had already overturned his previous suspension. When the vote reached the Senate, there were 35 yeses and 19 noes, making him 1 vote shy of the 2/3 vote to be impeached. Besides being impeached, Johnson did purchase Alaska from Russia, which was helpful territory to buy. In the end, Lincoln may not have been reelected without Johnson as his running mate, but when he was killed, we not only lost one of the country's best leaders, we inherited one of the worst. Many people regard Johnson as the worst president ever. After finishing his term, he retired and went back to the U.S. Senate. He is the only person to go from being a president to being a senator. We have had lots of presidents. We can't expect every single one of them to be good. Every president has a story about their presidency. Some good, some bad. Great leaders have gotten us out of a lot of holes in American history. Presidents have expanded the size of the country. They've inspired greatness in Americans. The president comes up with solutions. They know when to stop and when to go. They define what our history was and what our future will be. Their actions will decide what happens to this country.